Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you're having a brilliant day and welcome to From Blind Spots to Strongholds, how asset management strengthens cyber defenses and ensures compliance. I'm Katie Watson and I'll be your host today on behalf of Secon. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. Secon is a cybersecurity partner that's always on your side. Our purpose is to help organizations like yours take control of their security challenges with confidence, bringing clarity and capability, and adding a human touch to everything that we do. And today we're putting a spotlight on something that can sometimes be overlooked, but is absolutely vital: your asset inventory. For many organizations, it's seen as a static list, something you might pull out for an audit, but in the right hands, it becomes a live, dynamic source of intelligence that can uncover risks, strengthen defenses, and drive meaningful progress on compliance. We're very lucky today to be joined by Andy Norton, European Cyber Risk Officer at Armis, a seasoned cybersecurity expert with over 20 years of experience from Cymatic to FireEye and more. Andy has briefed global leaders and regulators, and today he'll be sharing how asset intelligence can become one of the most powerful tools in your cybersecurity strategy. Now, before I hand over to Andy to share some wisdom, just some housekeeping. So this webinar is recorded and the recording will be shared with you afterwards. We're going to be here for about 45 minutes and there will be a Q&A session taking place at the end. So feel free to submit your questions throughout using the Q&A function. If you have any questions after the webinar, you can also reach out to me at katie.watson@seconcyber.com. So without further ado, grab a cup of coffee and I'd like to hand it over to Andy.
Thanks, Katie. I've got my coffee. Well, thanks everyone. I appreciate you taking the time today. I think we've got a 45-minute session. So my plan was to kind of show you stuff for about 30 minutes and then see if there's questions. If there isn't, I've got some other stuff I can share with you as well, which are sort of a continuation from it. So I'm gonna share my screen now. And hopefully you can see my slides. So what we're going to cover really is, as Katie quite politely put it, the boring bit of asset management and how it's become increasingly important to many organizations with a particular risk profile. And so I'm going to give you examples of how our conversations with customers are occurring, the challenges they're facing, and how they're using increased capabilities and maturities in asset inventory to move the needle. Sounds a bit of a cliche, but to develop both proactive and reactive capabilities, which make it easier for them to understand what's important and what isn't. And I think that has become a challenge to many organizations, right? So this is what we're going to cover today. This was the agenda that we put out on social media. So I'm not going to talk about EU regulations like DORA and NIS2 because there's a million solicitors, lawyers' websites you can go on and find out about that stuff, right? What I am going to talk about though is how it's changed the behavior of organizations, right? Following from that, we're going to look at how sort of an improved posture in cyber helps you drive detection or resilience against advanced threats. Doesn't mean nation states, it just means, probably hands on keyboard, initial access brokers, SL level 3 and above, if you're familiar with OT regulations. But really understand how, I'm not going to be breaking too many thoughts on conventional wisdom here, but we have too many alerts and not enough people, right? And that is the noise that creates is the fundamental problem about holes in our resilience and blind spots, right? And then aligning compliance and security is not going to be a separate section. it's kind of the outcome of these things, right? They're one and the same, right? If you're doing compliance that doesn't improve your security or vice versa, you're probably doing the wrong thing, right? I've heard many people say compliance is a tick box exercise, but those people have never been responsible for compliance, right? And in my experience, it's not tick box at all. It's about measurements and metrics on how the security posture is functioning, right? So we're going to spend 30 minutes talking about these things. If there's some questions, great. If not, I'll show you some secret stuff. All right, so the regulatory piece is really around governance, risk, and compliance, right? And about how all geographies around the world are sort of following a very common path, right? NIS2 in Europe has probably been the preeminent or the first one to really sort of change the nature in way regulations are applied and compliance is measured. In that, there isn't fines associated with a breach in NIS2. There's fines associated with how you do security, whether your risk management processes, capabilities, maturity are in line with what's considered state-of-the-art best practice for organizations that are considered important or essential entities under NIS2. It's not on its own, right? There are many other pieces of law around the world that mimic or copy or philosophically are coming from the same place as NIS2. So the bit in the middle is a Florida bill, and it basically goes as far to say Florida businesses will not be liable in connection with a cybersecurity incident provided they comply with certain standards. So it's really putting the emphasis on the organization to demonstrate what they did. The line at the bottom is from the Telecom Security Act, recent bill or law in the UK, and it basically says it's a legal defense for organizations to demonstrate that they took all reasonable steps and exercise due diligence, right, in complying with TSA. Of course, it implies that the inverse is true, right, that it is not a legal defense if you can't demonstrate that you did all appropriate things to comply with TSA. Where this comes from, we have to look back sort of a decade, and probably one of the main instigators or catalysts for this change were data breaches like the Equifax breach, where it was seen as a test case for ESG, right? So environmental, social, and governance measurements, where cyber was an important piece of that. It was seen as how well organizations are seen to be managed, right? So their governance, risk, and compliance activities. The sentiment, right, in this is not that Equifax were attacked by a advanced threat actor and that it was unforeseen, that it was the blame is not being placed at the foot of the threat actor. The sentiment is that Equifax did not do the things they should have done, right? And so this was really the beginning of where all of this current legislation is coming from, right? You need to be seen that you are capable and reasonable directors of your organization and that you are doing appropriate and proportionate things, because this is the key thing to survival in the event of a breach, right? It's what you've done and how that is regarded as appropriate determines your culpability, liability, and consequently fine. We go forward a few more years, another very notable breach was that of Target. But this time the inference was different. Target had deployed cutting edge technology, and it was Firefly malware detonation technologies, right? So they were doing very, very advanced things in their environment. They were classifying them and enabling SOC teams and analysts to create an alerting funnel and really start to apply correct triage to their environment. The little square in the top right corner is called the diamond model of intrusion analysis, and we'll get to that later in the slides. But despite Target's investment in state-of-the-art technology, which is required by, or stated in law, there were other things that would have improved their maturity in their defenses, right? However, investing in state-of-the-art is considered to be the right thing to do. Consequently, despite them both being very significant breaches, when you look at the fines applied between Target and between Equifax, the difference was a multiple of 10. So the fine of Equifax was 10 times greater than the fine of Target. And a lot of that was to do with proving what was being done was appropriate and proportionate, and what the investment they'd made in their defenses was equal to the risk profile of that organization, right? So Target was seen to be doing better things, or the right thing, in comparison to Equifax, and consequently the fine and the ramifications were less. So when we now step forward to today, there are very strong commonalities in the types of organizations that are seeking to utilize their inventory and an understanding of their assets to drive many other functions of their cybersecurity posture, right? So here's some things that we often see, right? A lot of the companies that are dealing with this and adapting and changing to this tend to be ESG leaders. So they're either AA or AAA rated. They see governance as a differentiator to their organization, right? And it's held with esteem that they are indeed, systemically ahead of the curve, right? They will state in their annual report that cybersecurity is a strategic risk or a principal risk to the organization. They will always be looking for measurement, right? So they'll always be trying to decide whether they are overexposed or underexposed in a particular capability, right? And what I'm trying to say here is they are focused on running a tight ship, right? So they will always be tightening the sails, tweaking the rigging, making sure what they're doing fits their risk profile, right? And this is now beyond, they're beyond vertical markets, whether they're finance or pharmaceutical or manufacturing or critical infrastructure. Beyond that, it's organizations who are leaders and have a particular risk profile are the ones that are utilizing and building from the ground up their defenses based on their inventory. One way of defining what that is understanding your risk profile, right? So many of the organizations fit the IG3 profile. This is from the Center for Internet Security, and it basically means that an IG3 organization is regulated in some way, holds controlled data, whether it's intellectual property or PII data, has investments in cyber, and wishes to reduce the damage from a sophisticated adversary in their environment. If you fit that risk profile, then you need to determine what is appropriate and proportionate, and that influences the capability and maturity that each organization should be looking at. If you don't fit that risk profile, it's okay not to have the similar investment. If you look at the 5 stages of incremental capability and maturity, you'll see, first of all, under just decent risk management practices, it's important to have an inventory. It's important to address unauthorized new assets entering the environment, to have some sort of active discovery capability, so you're polling the environment, often difficult in OT, to integrate with other inventory-based tools like DHCP, and finally, to achieve an appropriate and proportionate capability and maturity for asset inventory. If your risk profile is IG3, it's to utilize a passive asset discovery tool. And that's because you'll see in all of the cybersecurity frameworks a reference to adaptive or optimizing or continuous being the top layer of capability, right? So organizations with a particular risk profile look for adaptive, optimizing, and continuously improving capabilities for the various controls under their or in their environment, under their posture. So if we look at then sort of what that asset inventory gives you, it's the ability to apply a lens at anywhere on this continuum of risk, right? So I've taken the NIST framework here as a circular wheel, but if you imagine we've stretched it out, our assets, our inventory appear somewhere on this continuum. Either this yellow explosion is what we call the boom event. This is a device that's no longer under our control, under our policies. Everything we do to the left is considered proactive or left of boom. Everything we do to the right is considered reactive or responding to an undesirable event occurring to one of our devices, right, or one of our critical assets. I'm going to look at just a couple of examples from both sides of the boom, right? So we'll start with a bit of left of boom, and then we'll look at stuff we're doing from right of boom. Okay, so here's one of the very simple things organizations can do beyond understanding what a threat adversary is doing. Again, it's looking at what you are in control of and you are able to manage, right? So we call this the long tail. And basically, it's all the brands of devices that we see in someone's standard operating environment, right? So you can see here their number one brand is that of Acer, followed by Apple, followed by Intel, followed by Microsoft, followed by Cisco. You can see that they have in total 340 different brands of devices in their environment. When we look deeper into the inventory, we can see that once we get to around halfway, so say 150 out of 340 brands of devices, we then get into very low numbers of brands. So you can basically, there's approximately half the inventory brands you can count on one hand, right? And then if we look again, single-use devices in this environment, approximately 100, right? So this is very common. That there is this long tail of devices in an environment, and the problem with that is normally they will fall outside of IT vulnerability management processes, right? They're largely, I don't want to call them shadow, but they won't be in some sort of patch management program. No one will know how they are configured, whether they're using default credentials, whether they're sitting on open ports. Very often we don't know where they are in the environment. And so each single brand we have comes at a cost, never mind just the licensing and support costs. But over half of this inventory is probably outside of best practice, right? Your vulnerability management initiatives will not be covering over half of the inventory. So understanding that and being able to apply a lens to this to reduce that number, so you can, because a lot of these things will be clones and provide very similar functionality to what's already part of the inventory, is a very, very simple way of reducing your exposure and reducing your risk. And then, of course, we get things like this, right? So then there's always the potential for rogue devices to be on the environment, right? So here I've highlighted a Wi-Fi pineapple, which would be an evil twin access point, and would be a security concern if you saw something like this in the environment. So proactively insight into the environment gives you the ability to apply management, gives you the ability to reduce risk and exposure, and also gives you the ability to spot when significant devices or threats occur in the inventory. Equally, you are then able to apply observations or findings to those devices in that environment, right? So pointing our resources at our most important problems is critical again. And so here you can see that we've highlighted of that inventory, which ones have, from a risk factor perspective, have the most simple, low-hanging potential to bring threat or increased risk into the environment. So we can see 0.04% are misconfigured, 8% are obsolete hardware and software, 4% are using insecure or default credentials, 6% have unencrypted traffic and behaviors to external networks, 10% have critical vulnerabilities. And where do we focus? We focus on those devices that have them all, right? And so out of, well, let's take, I don't know, 41,000 Aces, 28,000 Apples, we have 4 devices that require our most immediate attention because they have all of these risk factors present in their inventory. If we then flip it to being reactive, right? So this is an example of encounter rates, right? We all will encounter malware in different phases. If we look at the Armis knowledge base, you'll see that for every 500 million HTTP requests to external sites, approximately 500,000 return a site which is on listed as malicious on a threat intelligence feed. Right, so that's roughly 1 in every 1,000 HTTP connections bring an elevated level of risk into an environment. You can see this particular organization has 152,000 HTTP requests and 160 suspicious hosts. So they're pretty much right on the money for knowing how often they encounter malware. This doesn't mean to say it's an infected device. We haven't immediately gone to the far right of boom because there's different levels of maliciousness in encountering a threat on the internet as well. But what this allows you to do is keep your eyes on the fact that just because you're not seeing a malware infection every day, every week, doesn't mean that it's not going to happen, right? We all will encounter malware in a very, very similar way. So that leads us into then how organizations or what organizations have tried to do from a defensive perspective, right? And so one of the common misconceptions with defending against a malware threat is the perception that an attacker only has to be right once. That isn't the case. That's not what we've seen at all. And attackers have to be consistently correct across time in order for them to eventuate a severe incident or breach into an environment. Right? This is not a one-hit problem that's impossible to solve. When we look at how problems occur, we see that in almost all, probably all examples, organizations have alerts for the various pieces of evidence in a malware campaign in their alerting funnel. The problem is it's drowned out in noise with all the other alerts that they have in their funnel. Right? And so this is the real problem. It's being able to elevate those critical things from the noise. And so I'm not going to delve into the 2 examples, but that is the issue organizations deal with. We're going to get into the diamond model a little bit now. Here's an alert, right, from a very advanced maths-based anomaly technology. And it says, I have an unusual data transfer, which is unusual activity, to a rare connection from a server. Now, your analyst is going to spend time investigating this, right? If, however, we add corners to the diamond, I'll explain that in a second, but if we look at that alert from the viewpoint of a different technology, And here's the anomaly. This is the unusual connectivity. This is the rare connection from the server, this spike in traffic. We can see that if we add context to the alert, we can see that what caused it was an iPhone on the guest network talking to Apple, right? And so adding richness to our alerts helps our analysts understand which alerts they care about the most, and helps them understand which alerts they can ignore, and really tune that funnel down to manageable levels. Another very quick example, there's always been a reliance on PCAP, right? But PCAP is very hard to do. This is a Eternal Blue exploitation. This is probably top 3 most successful exploits of all time. And the normal methodology of deciding whether this is a real attack or not is looking at the PCAP. Now, this is the PCAP. Is it good? Is it bad? I've asked thousands of people that over the years. No one has ever given me a clear answer on it. Here is the reason. It is a buffer overflow of an NT trans command, right? And so you just have to take my word for that. However, now we have other ways of being able to have confidence in a conviction of the behavior of an asset, right? So if I understand the asset, I understand how it's behaving, I keep a journal of that, I can see that this asset has 193,000 SMB connections to the external world and 1,800 threat detections and 920 suspicious host requests, right? So with even looking at the PCAP, I have a significant amount of evidence that allows me to convict in a much quicker period of time. So this is the Diamond model, method of intrusion analysis from SANS. And it says basically, if you add information about an event from all 4 corners of the diamond, you'll give the analyst a much richer ability to discern good from bad, to discern very important from not so important, right? And that will help you filter out the noise, and that will help you get to those alerts that matter when they matter, right? Before it's all game over. When we look at the types of things that we consider on each side of the diamond, from the adversary perspective, this is very much the threat intel world, right? Domain names, file hashes, import hashes, IP addresses, who is information. There's many things that can help identify an adversary, right? From an infrastructure perspective, understanding where our sites are, understanding our boundaries. Is it the guest network? Do we care about it? What IP ranges are in use? What VLANs are in use? From an inventory perspective, we know our brands, the types and models of our devices, what applications they have installed, what software they have installed. And then what are they doing from a capability perspective? What ports do they listen on? What ports do they connect to? What IP addresses externally are they connecting to? What services are they running? Are they running any sort of remote access connectivity? Are they running RDP? Are they scanning SMB? Right. So if we're able to pull together as much information in this model as possible, we enable the analyst and any sort of AI to produce the most optimized form of alert. In terms of that, we coin this a centriction, right? So this is really us being able to blend adversary-based information with an unprecedented knowledge of our inventory. We should know our inventory better than the attacker. If we do, we're able to spot them in our environment because we can set traps for them, right? And so this is without any knowledge of the file hashes, the domain names, the IPs, the TTPs of the attacker, if we know how our inventory behaves, is structured, is comprised, we know what we shouldn't see, and the threat actor doesn't know that. Very small graphic here, but basically what we're looking at is a network where they use the 10 network for their inventory, and we've broken it down into sub-networks. So you can see there are single-digit devices in this one, 100 and something in that one, nothing in the 10.9. We know that. The adversary doesn't know that. We could build traps, honeypots, whatever they might be, to say if we see anything in the 10.9, then we can create a very strong alert. That's only one hypothesis. It might be that we're more concerned when threat actors get into networks that we do use, where our critical devices are, which is another hypothesis, right? And so we can see in the 10.226, we have 5,000 devices. This is clearly a business as usual network. What can we do in this environment? Well, in any structure, more often than not, there are unexplicable gaps in the inventory. And so what you're looking at here, we can see in this network, there's a Rockwell Automation PLC on .75, on .77, on .81, there is nothing. There never has been, and there's never been any activity on .81. This allows us to create a great policy to say if we see a new device, which is a different hypothesis, on .81, we can raise an alert. If we see any activity destined to .81, we can create an alert. We could go through, so we have Rockwell's on .93, .94, then another tripwire on .95. In this network, we can see more restrictions between devices here on .123, .46, right? So without there needing to be any prior knowledge of threat actor behaviors or TTPs, we know that these devices in a used network are dark, right? And so a hypothesis is the threat actor would get into the environment, look to move laterally, would look to do reconnaissance, discovery, and in doing so would hit these IPs that have never been used before. And that gives us a very, very strong behavioral footprint and level of confidence around conviction of a threat. I'll give you one example. We have a manufacturer who has 150,000 port scans a week. Great data, but unusable from a security action perspective. They profiled their environment, looking for where those port scans took place and the IPs that those port scans took place on, and found tripwires, found centrictions in that environment. And of 150,000, only one hit the profile of being a centriction, and that device that was doing the scanning was indeed a compromised device. So we took an event which is very useful from a investigative perspective, but too noisy because it just happens in nature anyway, and refined it to a point where the knowledge of the inventory allowed us to make that very actionable again. All right, so you can build very simple policies if you understand the behaviors of your inventory. So from that, you will be able to discern which devices perform port scans. We can say, all right, these are vulnerability scanners, these are our weekly, monthly scans. We can ignore those. We know we're only scanned on certain ports, right? So if I see anything outside of that port, I can create an alert. And I know that these IPs are omitted from port scans from IP ranges that are scanned. These IPs and these ports are not part of that port scan. So we can really find very, very strong indicators and deviations from what is considered business as usual. So this is moving now from, this is the stronghold that you get with a continuous understanding of your inventory, right? First and foremost, from a compliance perspective, you get a defensible maturity level of asset management, right? And so you can stand up before the audit committee, before the board, you can stand in front of their shareholders and our regulators and say, look, for our risk profile, this is considered appropriate, right? We understand our assets. That is a prerequisite for all other risk management decisions in your environment. Once you have that, once you have a superior knowledge of the inventory and you know the composition, grouping and behavior of the inventory, you're then able to do other things, right? So as I've just shown you, we can find in all the noise, in all the alerts, the ones that are of consequence, right? The ones that shouldn't be occurring, that are not business as usual. From a proactive perspective, we can also look for those, once we understand our inventory, we can look for, apply the critical vulnerabilities or weaknesses of those assets, right? And so again, we can bring more intelligence into our environment to say, look, we have 20,000 CVEs, but we only care about these 4. And finally, no one ever regretted running a tight ship, right? So, and that effectively, if you are an ESG leader, if being capable and reasonable is where your aim is, then running a tight ship is about as good as it gets. So so that was it. I think that is our 30 minutes or just over. Is there any questions?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andy. That was really informative and I found that really helpful. So we do have one question from Mahesh. Will the IG3 framework vary between industries like finance versus manufacturing?
Simple and great answer is no, it doesn't. It's purely about risk profile. It doesn't. You might not from an IG3 perspective, right? You're going to have, like, DORA will stipulate different things than NIS2, or DORA will be more applicable. But if you're focused on your risk profile, then IG3 applies whether you're finance, whether you're a port authority, whether you're an airline, whether you're a manufacturer of Christmas trees.
And then where can you get a copy of the IG3 framework?
You can go to cissecurity.org. In fact, what we'll do, Katie, is we'll put that link in the slides and when we send it out. How about that?
Brilliant. That's perfect. And then I did have a question regarding the journey of asset management, because I thought that would be quite helpful, is for those who are on that journey of going from, just having a list to actually using it, like you said, as a defense. What challenges do you see organizations experience when they take that journey from that very initial step to kind of having that strong ship, like you said?
Okay. So I think the most common answer is culture.
Mm-hmm.
That is the biggest challenge. That is the biggest indicator of success in cyber or not. So if you have different groups, I'll give you one example. We have a company that bought or has 39 subsidiaries, and each subsidiary has its own CISO.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They all, one like CrowdStrike, one like SentinelOne. It was a mess, right? And they couldn't get any. There was no buy-in. There was no efficiency of scale. There was nothing, right? And every time they tried to do something, it was blocked by one individual or another, right? By picking a framework, right, and aligning the company around a framework, it created a culture where they automatically understood what they needed to do. So, if you've got an Excel spreadsheet with your assets on, and you as a company decide you're an IG1 organization, fine, you don't need to do continuous asset discovery, right? You're good with your Excel spreadsheet. But if your audit committee, board, regulators decide you are an important entity under NIS2 or regulated under DORA, or you consider yourself to be IG3, then you scroll across, work your way down and say, right, this is the capability that we need to be appropriate for our risk profile. So cultural buy-in is the most important thing to do.
That's a fantastic answer. I guess it's making sure everyone is singing from that same hymn sheet and all have that shared objective, which I could imagine be quite difficult, like you said, if you've got people preferring different tools, working with different, like if everyone has a shared agenda and everyone's working towards that makes complete sense. So we do have another question in the chat. Mahesh has asked, is cyber hygiene and IG3 different? I'm referring to Cyber Essentials Plus versus ISO 27001.
They're not. They're all the same. What you'll find with things like Cyber Essentials and 27001 is they will make sense around what you need to do, but they won't tell you how you need to do it. Right. And so that's where the syscontrols comes in. It's kind of that foundation that says, okay, you want to be 27001 compliant, right? Okay, it's first cab off the rank says you need to do risk management. What's your risk profile? Are you 1, 2, or 3? Right. So that they kind of all knit together really, and they very much act as support points and rationale for making decisions. Like, why have you bought this tool? Because we are IG2 and because we need active discovery in our environment, and this allows us to say we're doing active discovery, for example.
Brilliant. I hope that answers your question. And then I guess we have 3 minutes left. So I don't know if that's time for you, Andy, to show us some more cool stuff, or if we have time for any more questions.
I'll tell you what, why don't we let's do another one next quarter, and I'll show you the cool stuff next quarter. How about that?
Brilliant. That's great to hear. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Like I said, a recording will be sent to you after, as well as a blog post describing everything we've discussed today. If you do have any more questions or any more information, please do get in touch. And thank you again, Andy, for joining us and sharing that wisdom. It was really helpful.
No problem. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Brilliant. Thank you.